So now that we got started with Vue.js in the last course module, in this module we're going to explore Vue's core concepts, the essentials you gotta know when you want to work with Vue. Specifically in this module, we're going to dive into how exactly Vue interacts with HTML and how a concept called templates is related to that. We're going to take another look at outputting dynamic content and explore more options and alternatives there. And we'll also react to user input. I guess we already did this in the first course module, but there's more to it. And in this module, we're going to explore this in depth as well. So now that we have a basic idea of why we might want to use Vue, let's indeed jump into Vue and its basics and its core syntax. And for that, I got a very simple starting project, if you want to call it like this, a simple web page, which you of course find attached to this lecture so that you can start with the same project. Now, I opened it here in a browser simply by double clicking that HTML file side by side with my editor, just so that it's a bit easier to see what changes on the page once we start writing some code. Now, speaking of code, this is a very simple starting project. If I briefly hide this sidebar here, also with the shortcut, you see the HTML skeleton is very simple. I just got a header, got a section, an h2 tag, and an empty paragraph tag. And I gotta import where I import Vue, so the Vue framework, and I gotta import to my own app.js file, and also import to some Google Fonts and my own CSS file. Now, the CSS file is not too important. It has some basic styles, but this is not a CSS course, so I won't bore you with those. I do have a separate CSS course if you want to learn more about that. Instead, let's focus on JavaScript and Vue. And here the JavaScript file is totally empty. Now here's one thing I'll do, and I'll not do this throughout the entire course, but I'll do it here at the beginning. I'll change the editor layout here in Visual Studio Code to use 2 rows, and I'll open the index.html file in the top row and the app.js file in the bottom row and close the sidebar. I'm doing this because this will allow me to show you how our JavaScript code and the HTML code interacts. Later, once we write more complex JavaScript code, I'll move away from this setup so that we can see the JavaScript code on the entire page. But to get started, this will be just fine. So with that, we got the HTML code, we got the JavaScript code. Now, the first thing we want to do when we want to use some Vue features is we want to connect Vue to our HTML code. We want to let Vue know which part of this HTML code should be controlled by Vue, because we'll only be able to utilize Vue in parts that are controlled by Vue. Now, here my first goal is very simple. I got this dummy web page where I want to output my course goal, or your course goal. Something like finish the course, master Vue, anything like that. Now, of course, we can just write that in here and we're done. But this course is about Vue, and whilst controlling this with Vue and outputting this text with Vue will be a bit overkill for now, it is good to get started with a basic example like that so that we can later also explore more advanced examples. Therefore, let's not output this text like this, but let's instead use Vue to output some text here, some text which we potentially could change dynamically. And for that, the first thing we need to do is we need to create a Vue app. This is always the first step. You want to control a part of your HTML code with a Vue app. And you do this by using Vue, which is a globally available object thanks to this Vue import. And then on this Vue object, we can call create app. And this will do what the name implies. It creates a Vue app. Now we can store this app in a variable or constant. So here I'll store it in a constant. And this is a default JavaScript feature, has nothing to do with Vue. And now we want to let Vue know which part of this HTML code should be controlled by that Vue app. Now I want to control this section because it's this section which contains this paragraph which I want to manipulate through view. We could also just control this paragraph, but we will later add more features inside of this section, hence I'll take the entire section. Now we do that by calling mount, the mount method on this app object which we created with createApp. Mount now wants a string, and that string should hold a CSS selector which uniquely identifies the element in our DOM, in our HTML code, which we want to control. Now here, this section has an ID of user goal. So we can use this ID. And typically you will use IDs because you want a unique selector. And IDs are great unique selectors because IDs should be unique on your page. Now, how does such an ID selector look like? Well, it's simply a hash symbol and then your ID, in this case, user goal. And this will tell Vue that we want to connect our created Vue app to this section in the HTML code. Now, if we save the app.js file, this connection is established. But the connection alone doesn't do much. Instead, we can now use Vue features to interact with this control section. And we do use such features by passing an object to createApp. This is an object which we can use to configure this app. We configure the various options of this app, you could say. Now, one key option which we can set is the data option, the data configuration. And this name is not up to you. It has to be data. You can use some clearly defined specific keys, so property names, in this object which you pass to createApp. You cannot just use any arbitrary names because Vue will look for these specific property names, like data, and like a couple of other names you'll see throughout this course. So here we get the data key. Data wants a function as a value. So we could provide one like this, and that would be totally valid, or we use the method shorthand, which we can use in modern JavaScript, which is supported here. And that looks like that. It's the same. It basically means the value stored in the data property is a function. Now, what should this function do? It should do one very simple yet important thing. It returns an object, and always an object. Not an array, not a number, not a string, always an object. And in this returned object, you can now set up any key value pairs with any key, so with any property names of your choice. Something like message or course goal, totally up to you. And the values for those properties are also totally up to you. Here I'm going to store a string, but you could store anything that makes sense for your use case, for your application. You could store a boolean, you could store a number, you could store an array, or yet another object. But here I want a simple string. My course goal could be finish the course and learn Vue. Now, what's the idea behind this? What's the idea behind this data property, which we now configured in this Vue app? Well, anything that's part of the object you return in data can now be used in your Vue-controlled HTML part. And whilst this is not too exciting for static content which never changes, like our string here, this will be super awesome as soon as we add some reactivity. And we, for example, react to the user clicking a button to then change data. You got a first glimpse at that in the first course module, and you'll see way more of that throughout the course. But to start simple, we can output what's stored in course goal in this Vue-controlled HTML part by using a special syntax here. A special syntax which will only work because this is controlled by Vue. To output data in your Vue-controlled HTML part, there is a special syntax which is only available in HTML parts that are controlled by Vue. Because what Vue will do behind the scenes is it will scan this HTML code, you could say, and detect certain features, a certain syntax which it supports. And the syntax we're going to use here for outputting text for outputting content in your template is this one. Double curly braces, opening and closing. By default, if you use that in HTML, this will do nothing. Well, actually, you will simply see that on the screen thereafter. If you use this syntax in a view-controlled HTML snippet, it will do something special. Between those opening and closing double curly braces, you can reference your returned data object properties, like course goal. So here we can write course goal, and Vue will make that connection, will understand that you want to output the content stored in course goal here, and it'll do just that. So if you save this, HTML and JavaScript, if both is saved, and you reload your web page, you will see finish the course and learn Vue here. Just like that. And this is pretty amazing, even though of course it's a very simple app. But keep in mind that this text is stored in JavaScript, yet it's rendered on the screen thanks to Vue and this special syntax. And this syntax here is called interpolation. You don't need to remember this, but that's its name. Interpolation simply means that in here you can reference properties that are part of that object you return in data, and then the value of that property will be output instead of this part. And Vue will automatically detect this and do all that outputting part for you if you use this syntax. And just to make this really clear, if you would use this anywhere else, let's say here in the header, which is not Vue controlled, you would just see this as text and it would not be replaced because that is really only a Vue feature, this interpolation syntax. And this interpolation syntax is key. We're going to use it a lot throughout the course because it's one of the key features of Vue, which is why I'm getting started with it. It's also worth noting that you cannot just output text like this, but you could also output a number if I save that. And you could also output something like true or false if you wanted to. Now, if you have an array in there, let's say, you can also output that, as we see. So it's really flexible. You can, for example, also output an object like this. So it's really flexible regarding what you can do, but here we want that string, so I'm going to use that. Now that's interpolation and the data property in the object you use for configuring your app, your Vue app. And this is the first very important takeaway, or the first two important takeaways. These are two core features, data and interpolation, which we're going to use throughout the entire course and which you will definitely use in any Vue app you're building. Now we covered two super important features. How we create a Vue instance and configure the data that we can use there, and how we can output data with interpolation. Now, you don't always want to use interpolation for outputting data though. Here's an example. Let's say we have a second paragraph where I say learn more about Vue, and I want to make sure that about Vue is a link. Now, of course, we can use an anchor tag with the ref attribute for that and wrap that around about Vue. If I do that, this is what we get. And now in here, we can pass in our link. Now, just as before, we could absolutely hard code this here in our HTML code. But let's again store the link value in our Vue app instead, and then add some syntax to output the stored value here, simply so that later in the next step we can make this a bit more dynamic. So for that, I'm going to add a second property to this object which is returned in data, and I'll name it Vue link. And now this, again, is a string that can lead to a page where you can learn more about Vue. Now here, I'm simply going to use the official Vue web page, but again, you can of course use anything here. Now this Vue link property now holds the link that should be output here. And we can of course try to use our curly braces here, just as we did it between the paragraph tags. Now I'm doing this on the ref attribute. So here we then point at Vue link, save this, reload, and click about Vue. As you see, this fails, And why does it fail? Well, let's inspect this with the browser developer tools real quick. I'm using Chrome here, where you can right-click something to inspect it. And you will see that the value for the ref attribute is actually the unconverted double curly brace syntax. So clearly Vue did not replace this with the actual value stored in Vue link as it did it before for this course goal part. Now, why did Vue not do that? We are inside of the Vue controlled HTML code, so Vue should detect this. Well, the reason is simple. This double curly brace syntax is only available between opening and closing HTML tags, you could say. So anywhere where you would, well, output actual content. If you want to pass in a dynamic value to an attribute, like here, where I want to set the value of the ref attribute dynamically with help of Vue, we need to use a different syntax, which thankfully is available though. And that's the Vue binding syntax. For that, we use a so-called Vue directive, which is simply an extra instruction we add in the HTML code. And we can use such directives on HTML elements, like on this anchor element. The directive we need here is vbind. Vbind is a reserved name, detected and understood by Vue, and you can tell that it's by Vue because it starts with v-. All built-in directives which ship with Vue start with v-, and we're going to see a couple of other ones too throughout the course. Now, what does this vbind directive do? As I said, a directive is basically an instruction. An instruction we give to Vue to do something. And vbind tells Vue to bind, so to set, the value of something. And the of something part basically just means of an attribute on an HTML element. And to let Vue know which attribute's value to set, we add a colon after vbind and then the attribute name, in this case ref. And this is the full syntax which Vue will understand to dynamically set a value of an HTML element attribute, in this case of the ref attribute. This tells Vue, please bind, please set the value of the ref attribute to something. And now the to something is passed between the opening and closing double quotes here. And here again, you can now reference a value of your data object. So in this case, Vue link, for example, just like this. So this here, vbind, is basically, you could say, the attribute alternative to this interpolation syntax. You use interpolation between HTML tags, and if you need to set the value on an HTML tag, so to an attribute like this, you use vbind. If you now save this and reload, if we now click this link, I'm taken to the Vue docs. So I'm basically forwarded to the page this link points at. So now this works, and vbind, just like interpolation, is a key feature you need to know. Because typically you don't just want to output content between opening and closing tags. Often you have the scenario that you need to bind, that you need to set the value of some HTML attribute to some Vue managed data. And with vbind, that's very easy to do. So with interpolation and vbind, we learned about two key features for outputting and for using Vue managed data in the HTML code. And that is really important. Now let's make our app at least a bit more dynamic. And for that, let's say we actually have two possible course goals which we want to output here. And for the moment, we'll randomly decide which one to output. Now for that, we need to run some code. We need to basically roll a dice, you could say, and then either use this text or another text as a course goal. And we can do this with another option we can set on this Vue app object. We already set the data option. Now it's time to learn about a new option. And that's the methods option. Methods allows you to define functions which should execute when something happens. When you call them, for example, or as you will learn later, when a user event like a button click occurs. To methods, you pass a JavaScript object. So that's an important difference to data. Data itself was a function, a method. Methods takes an object which will be full of methods, so of functions. But these functions are now totally up to you. You can name them however you want. For example, output goal. But this is totally up to you. This can be any name you want. Methods, on the other hand, just like data, is a reserved term, is a reserved name. But inside of this method's object, you can use whatever you want. The only important thing here is that all your properties you define in this method's object need to be functions, because they need to be callable as functions. And you can either do it like this or use the method shorthand in here, just as we did it with data. Now, in output goal, we could now calculate a random number with math random, which is a built-in function in JavaScript, totally unrelated to Vue. It's a core JavaScript function, and it will simply calculate a random number between 0 and 1. And here we could then simply add a if check and say if random number is smaller than 0.5, we want to return learn Vue as a goal, and else return master Vue. Whatever you want. Those strings are up to you. And now we got this function, this method, output goal, which will either return this or this text. Now we want to use this text here in this paragraph to, well, display a different text every time this page is reloaded. So for that we need to call this function somehow so that it executes. And the cool thing is we can call a method, so a function defined in this method's object, in our HTML code just as we can point at a data property. You can do both. So here, right now, we're pointing at a data property, but we can also instead, if we want to, execute a function that is defined in methods. That's just important. It needs to be defined in methods. So adding output goal here directly in that config object you passed to create app would not work, for example. But since output goal is defined in methods, we can call it here, and since we want to call it, we need to add parentheses here, just like in regular JavaScript. And that's the interesting part, by the way. In your view-controlled HTML code, in this interpolation syntax, but also when using this binding syntax, you can execute simple JavaScript code. For example, here we could also execute 1 plus 1 if we wanted to. We could also execute math random here if we wanted to. What you can't do in here is write complex code. For example, you can't use if statements in here. This will not work. But you can use ternary expressions, and you can write any JavaScript expression between your double curly braces and when using vbind. And therefore, since we can use such basic JavaScript expressions, we can also call output goal here, like this. And if I save that and reload, I see learn Vue. If I reload, at some point I'll see master Vue. I'll see a different value from time to time because we always calculate a brand new value because this gets called. And I'm showing this to you because it is important to understand how Vue works, that you can execute JavaScript expressions here between the curly braces and when using vbind, and that this gives you a lot of flexibility, because just by using this very simple example, our application here is at least a bit more dynamic, because now we don't always see the same text here. Instead, after some reloads, it changes. And that is a more dynamic application which we can easily build with Vue and which we couldn't build with just HTML without JavaScript. So with that, we're already getting closer to seeing why Vue is really amazing, and we built our first, at least a bit more dynamic application. So now we know how to build our Vue app, how to output content or bind attributes, and that we can either set up some data in data and refer to that in our HTML code, or that we can also define methods which are called. It really depends on what you're building and what your application goal is in the end. Now, before we practice those first important concepts, there are a couple of other things you should know about Vue and how to work with its data. For example, let's say we have our course goals stored in data properties. We got our course goal A here, and we got our course goal B here. Master Vue and build amazing apps. So we got our two different goals here now. And instead of returning hard-coded strings here in output goal, I want to output one of these two goals which are defined in data. This is very easy to do in Vue, but it uses a special feature or a syntax which you should be aware of. Let's say here, if the random number is smaller than .5, I want to return course goal A. Now we can't just write course goal A here. This would not be valid JavaScript. With this code, JavaScript would look for a course goal A variable or constant, which it wouldn't find. Because here course goal A is not a variable or constant, it's a property of this object. But instead we can use a syntax which you probably wouldn't think that it works. You can use this.courseGoalA. Now, depending on your level of JavaScript knowledge, this might look very strange. The this keyword is a core keyword in JavaScript, and it can be tricky. But in this context, this should not refer to this object here. It should refer to something else, and it normally would. But Vue does some magic here. It basically takes all the data you return in this data object, which you return in the data method, and it merges it into a global Vue instance object. So into your Vue app object, you could say. So these three data properties are available in a behind-the-scenes managed Vue app object. Your methods are also available there, and they do have access to anything stored in that global object through the this keyword. And that's why in this custom method inside of methods, we can use this to refer, for example, to our data. So we can do this here as well. This course goal B. And if I save that and reload, we therefore now output these different course goals which are stored in our data with help of this method. And having that knowledge of the this keyword and what it refers to inside of your methods in your Vue app, that's important because we're going to work with that a lot throughout this course. So at this point, the good news is that we covered almost all important features and functionalities that are related to outputting data, namely interpolation and the vbind directive, also combined with the knowledge that you can output either data or the result of method calls, like we're doing it here. Now there's one more feature, one more directive you should be aware of. Let's say one of the two goals, let's say course goal B, is actually not just a simple string like this, but this is some HTML code. And this could be a scenario you have in an application, where you, for example, fetch the data that should be output from a database, and from there you're getting some structured HTML code. Now, if you use HTML elements in that string, and you output this with interpolation, so with the double curly braces, you'll see that the HTML elements are just output as text. So they are not interpreted as HTML. And that actually is a useful security feature because it protects you against cross-site scripting attacks. So this is good. But sometimes you want to output this as HTML and not as text that looks like HTML. And for that you got another directive you can use. And that is the v-html directive. We saw vbind before. Vbind can be used to bind, so to set the values of attributes. With vhtml, you set the content between opening and closing tags of an element, but you now tell Vue that the content should be interpreted as HTML. So it should not be output as text as it is with double curly braces. And therefore, you no longer use double curly braces here, but instead the value you pass to vHTML between the double quotes here would be course goal B, for example, or also, if you wanted to, the result of calling output goal. This also works. And if I now reload, you see from time to time, this is the H2 tag. The text is just green, which is why you don't see it because of my styling. But this now is interpreted as HTML. Course goal A is also interpreted as HTML, but in there I got no HTML tags. So this is a feature you can use. I'm going to comment it out here because we don't need it here, but I wanted to make you aware of it. If you get some content stored in your Vue app which contains HTML code that should be treated as HTML, the vHTML directive, which is built into Vue, will help you with that. Now, chances are you'll not need it too often, and you should definitely not use it as a default, because you can introduce security issues with that because you basically circumvent the built-in cross-site scripting attack protection you have with the double curly braces. But if you know what you're doing and you need to output something as HTML, the vHTML directive is your friend. Well, and these are some basics about working with a Vue app and outputting content with data or with a method which you call. And therefore I'd say, next it's time to practice this a bit. So now before we dive into our first practice of those key features you learned about, it's also time for a first brief summary of what we learned. And we mostly learned about how to create Vue apps and how to connect them to HTML code with mount, that you should use some unique CSS selector here, like here the ID selector, because every Vue app can only be connected to one HTML element. And you also see already that if you control an element with Vue, like here, where we are controlling the section with Vue, you automatically also control all child elements, but not any elements outside of this Vue control section in this case. So one Vue app can control one part in the HTML code, but it then automatically controls all child elements as well. Well, and in this Vue controlled HTML code, you can use special features like this interpolation syntax with the double curly braces, or this binding syntax, this binding directive with vbind, or vHTML, as you also saw before. These are features which are available in that Vue-controlled HTML code. Now, you can output data in there. Therefore, this interpolation and this binding syntax is also summarized under the term data binding, because we're binding data which we manage in our Vue app to the HTML code, either with the interpolation or with the vbind directive syntax. And that's the important thing. You pass an object to your Vue app, which you create with create app, and this object configures this app. You can set various options, for example, the data option or the methods option. Obviously, we're going to learn about other options throughout the course, but these are two super important options which you will probably need in any app you're building. The data option takes a function, therefore you can write it like this, which should return an object full of data, which will then be available in your Vue-controlled HTML code, like Vue link here, and which can also be accessed from inside your other parts of the Vue app, like the methods, with the this keyword. Methods are also important. These are functions which you can call from inside your Vue-controlled HTML code, for example. And that's what you'll learn about thus far. Now, therefore, when we work with a framework like Vue, we typically say that we use a declarative approach, or that Vue uses a declarative approach. And that's just a fancy way of saying we, as a developer, define the goal. We define a template, you could say, of the content we want to have. We mark the parts which are dynamic, like this one, or like this ref attribute here, which is bound with vbind. And Vue will then do the rest for us. It does all the magic behind the scenes, it outputs concrete values here, and it updates the real DOM, which is rendered to the screen and what the user sees behind the scenes on our behalf. So we as a developer just define the final picture with the dynamic placeholders, you could say, and we don't define all the steps of getting that picture onto the screen. That's what we do with a framework like Vue, and that's why we also typically say that Vue uses a declarative approach. We just declare our goal, we don't care about the steps of getting there. Now it's time to practice this.